When I was a child, every day somebody asked me to sing. And at that time it was boring for me because I preferred to stay with my friends outside. And probably step by step I thought, okay, it's my destiny. Probably I have to sing in my life, I think.
There are voices that entertain, and then there are voices that seem to reach somewhere deeper, into memory, into grief, into hope. Andrea Bocelli's voice belongs to that second category. For more than 3 decades, it has filled opera houses, stadiums, wedding halls, and living rooms around the world. But long before the standing ovations, before the duets with Celine Dion, before he sang for popes and presidents, Andrea Bocelli was a boy in the Tuscan countryside who could not see the faces of the people he loved. This is the story of how he turned that darkness into one of the most recognizable voices in modern history. Andrea Bocelli was born on September 22, 1958, in the small Tuscan town of Longtime, to Alessandro and Eddie Bocelli. Even before he took his first breath, his life was already marked by uncertainty. Doctors had warned his mother that the child she was carrying might be born with serious health complications, and they suggested she consider ending the pregnancy. Eddie refused. She chose to give her son a chance, whatever that chance might look like. It was a decision Bocelli would speak about many times in later years, crediting his mother's choice as the reason he exists at all, and as the foundation of his lifelong belief in the value of every human life, however fragile it may seem at the start. Her instincts, in a sense, were confirmed. Andrea was born with congenital glaucoma, a condition that affected his eyesight from the very beginning. He could see, but only partially and only with great difficulty. It was not the ending of his story, it was the opening line. The Bocelli family lived modestly in La Sturza, a quiet farming hamlet near Longtime, where they sold agricultural equipment and made wine. There was no luxury, no early hint of the global fame to come. Just fields, animals, family meals, and the particular quiet of rural Tuscany. Andrea grew up alongside his younger brother, Alberto, in a household where music was simply part of daily life, the way weather or mealtimes are part of daily life. It was in that ordinary setting that something extraordinary began to take shape. At 6 years old, Andrea started piano lessons. It wasn't long before one instrument wasn't enough. He went on to learn the flute, the trumpet, the trombone, the saxophone, the guitar, and the drums, moving through them with the restless curiosity of a child who has found the one thing that makes the world make sense. His mother later said that music was the only thing that could truly calm him, the one language that seemed to settle something inside him no matter how unsettled the rest of the world felt. The real turning point came from an unexpected source, his nanny, Oriana, who gave him a record by the great Italian tenor Franco Corelli. For a boy who experienced so much of the world through sound rather than sight, hearing that voice was less like listening to music and more like discovering a doorway. He became fascinated, almost obsessed, with the human voice itself, what it could do, how it could move people, how far it could travel. By the time he was 7, he could identify famous singers just by hearing a few notes, and he had already begun trying to imitate the singers he admired most. Then, at 12 years old, everything shifted again. While playing football with other boys, Bocelli was struck in the eye. It was, on the surface, an ordinary childhood accident, the kind that happens on playgrounds everywhere. But for a boy whose vision was already fragile, the impact was devastating. The injury caused him to lose what remained of his sight. Doctors tried everything available to them at the time, including treatments now considered almost primitive, to save what vision he had left. Nothing worked. From that day forward, Andrea Bocelli lived in total blindness. It is tempting, looking back from the vantage point of his fame, to frame this moment as simply the price he paid for the voice he would later have, as though one loss was somehow traded for one gain. But that framing does a disservice to the boy who actually lived through it. There was no guarantee, at 12 years old, that blindness would lead anywhere except a much harder life. What we know now is that music did not fill the silence left by his lost sight. It had already been there, waiting, and it simply became the place he poured everything into. He kept singing. He performed at small local gatherings, then in a modest concert near his hometown. At 14, he entered a singing competition and won it, performing the classic Neapolitan song, O Sol Mio. It wasn't fame. It wasn't even a hint of the career to come. But it was proof to himself, if to no one else, that his voice carried something real. After finishing secondary school in 1980, Bocelli made a choice that surprises people who only know him as a singer. He enrolled at the University of Pisa to study law. It's easy to see, in hindsight, why music eventually won out. But at the time, a singing career must have seemed like an enormous risk for a young blind man with no connections in the music industry and no guarantee that talent alone would be enough. To pay his way through his studies, Bocelli performed in piano bars in the evenings, singing for tips and small fees in front of audiences who had no idea they were listening to a future global star. Those years mattered more than they might have seemed at the time. It was in those unglamorous rooms, night after night, that he built the confidence and stage presence that would later carry him through opera houses and Olympic ceremonies. It was also in 1987 where he met Enrica, the woman who would become his first wife. Bocelli did finish his law degree and briefly worked as a court-appointed lawyer. But music kept calling him back, quietly and persistently, the way it had since he was a boy at the piano. Every extraordinary career seems to have one moment that historians and fans point back to, the hinge on which everything turned. For Bocelli, that moment came in 1992. The Italian singer Zucchero was searching for a tenor to record a demo of his song Miserere. Bocelli auditioned. What happened next reads almost like fiction. Luciano Pavarotti, one of the greatest tenors of the 20th century, heard the demo and personally encouraged Zucchero to choose Bocelli for the recording. For a man who had once been a child imitating famous singers from records, having his talent recognized by one of the singers he most admired must have felt almost unbelievable. That recording opened doors that had never been opened to him before. Soon he was performing across Europe. After being discovered by producer Caterina Caselli, he signed with Sugar Music and began his professional recording career in earnest. In 1994, Bocelli entered the Sanremo Music Festival with the song Il mare calmo della sera, and won the newcomers category with a record-breaking score. His debut album achieved platinum status within weeks. That same year, he made his opera debut as Macduff in Verdi's Macbeth, and performed for Pope John Paul II at St. Peter's Basilica, an almost unimaginable trajectory for a man who, only a few years earlier, had been singing for tips in piano bars. Then, in 1995, came the song that would introduce him to the entire world, Canti per Tiro. The English-language version, recorded with Sarah Brightman as Time to Say Goodbye, became a global phenomenon, breaking sales records across multiple countries. The boy who had lost his sight on a football pitch in Tuscany had become an international icon. His voice carried into millions of homes that had never heard of Leggiatico. The years that followed read like a list of milestones few artists ever come close to achieving. In 1998, Bocelli took on the demanding operatic role of Rodolfo in Puccini's La Bohème, proving to any remaining skeptics that his ambitions extended well beyond pop crossover success. He made his American debut at the Kennedy Center in Washington, D.C., and was welcomed at the White House by President Bill Clinton the following day. He was named among People magazine's 50 Most Beautiful People, and he joined Celine Dion for The Prayer, a duet that would win a Golden Globe and earn an Academy Award nomination, becoming one of the defining vocal collaborations of its era. In 1999, his album Sacred Arias reached #1 on the U.S. classical charts, making him the first vocalist ever to hold the top 3 spots on that chart simultaneously across multiple releases. It was a staggering commercial achievement for an artist whose core instrument was, essentially, a trained operatic voice. But success brought its own weight. In 2000, Bocelli lost his father. During his famous concert beneath the Statue of Liberty in New York not long after, he dedicated his performance to him, turning what could have been just another triumphant show into something quietly personal, a son singing to a father who could no longer hear him in front of an audience who mostly had no idea. Over the following decade, Bocelli's career only expanded. In 2010, he performed Bridge Over Troubled Water at the Grammy Awards as a tribute to victims of the Haiti earthquake, then received a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. He toured Scandinavia, Asia, and Europe, sang Nessun Dorma at the opening of Expo 2010 in Shanghai, and drew more than 12,000 people to a free outdoor concert in Singapore. He performed at the ancient Odeon of Herod's Atticus in Athens and near the pyramids of Giza. Every year seemed to add another improbable chapter. Arenas in London, Madison Square Garden, the Staples Center, to a career that had started with a boy singing in a piano bar to pay his university fees. Behind the public triumphs was a more private story, one the Bocelli family has always guarded carefully. He married Enrica Cinzotti in 1992, the same year Pavarotti's endorsement changed his career. They had 2 sons together, Amos and Matteo, and lived for a time in relative quiet in Tuscany, away from the growing noise of his fame. In 2002, after a decade of marriage, Andrea and Enrica separated. Neither of them has ever publicly detailed the reasons, and the family has maintained that silence for more than 20 years. A rare thing in an industry that usually turns every private moment into a headline. That same year, on a rainy night in Tuscany, Bocelli met Veronica Berti, then 18 years old. According to accounts he has given over the years, he didn't see her before he heard her. She had wandered into a room with a piano and began singing quietly to herself, and Bocelli, drawn by the sound, happened to walk by. For a man whose entire relationship with the world had always run primarily through sound rather than sight, it was a fittingly poetic way to meet the person who would become his second wife. Despite a 25-year age gap, the two built a life together for more than a decade before marrying in March 2014, choosing a date that also marked the birthday of their daughter, Virginia, born in 2012. Bocelli has spoken about the particular ache of fatherhood as a blind man, unable to see his children's faces develop, forced instead to learn them through touch, tracing his hands over Virginia's nose and cheeks the way sighted fathers simply look. It is one of the few times he has allowed the public a glimpse of what his blindness genuinely costs him, beneath all the achievement built on top of it. His son Amos, who has full vision, chose music anyway, becoming a pianist and performing alongside his father. In 2018, his younger son Matteo joined him for the duet Fall on Me, a performance that needed no explanation of what it meant for a father who could not see his son's face to sing beside him regardless. The family eventually settled at Villa Alpamare, a pink villa on the Tuscan coast that Bocelli purchased in the late 1990s and transformed from an old hotel into a home filled with music and family life. Veronica became far more than a spouse. She took on the role of vice president of the Andrea Bocelli Foundation and became deeply involved in managing and shaping his career and public projects. Not everyone has agreed on what to make of Andrea Bocelli's voice, and that disagreement has followed him for his entire career. Respected figures within classical music, including his own early teacher Franco Corelli, recognized something genuine in his talent from the start. Fellow performers who have shared the stage with him, and superstar collaborators like Celine Dion and producer David Foster, have spoken about the emotional power his voice carries, describing it as something that reaches people in ways that technical perfection alone cannot explain. At the same time, some classical critics, including writers at major publications, have argued that Bocelli's technique doesn't always meet the traditional standards expected of a professional opera tenor, pointing to questions about breath control, vocal projection, and how his sound holds up outside a studio or amplified setting. It's a genuine and long-running debate within classical music circles, not a fringe complaint. Bocelli's career has always existed somewhere between two worlds, the emotional, accessible world of crossover pop balladry, and the far stricter, more technical world of traditional opera, and he has rarely fit neatly into either. What's remarkable is how little that debate seems to have affected the size and loyalty of his audience. Millions of listeners who may never have set foot in an opera house have found something in his voice that speaks to them directly, regardless of what conservatory-trained critics make of his vocal technique. Perhaps that tension between critical skepticism and mass emotional connection is itself part of what makes his story so enduring. Today, decades after that afternoon on a football pitch took his remaining sight, Andrea Bocelli shows no sign of slowing down. He recently marked the 30th anniversary of his breakout album Romanza with a major world tour, taking him through stadiums across Europe and arenas throughout North America. Cities like Vienna, Seattle, Los Angeles, and New York, many of the same kinds of venues where he first proved, decades ago, that his voice could fill spaces far larger than any piano bar. Earlier this year, He stood among the headline performers at the opening ceremony of the Winter Olympics in Milan, sharing the stage with Mariah Carey in front of a worldwide television audience. One more entry on a resume that already includes performances for popes, presidents, and royalty. It would be easy to tell Andrea Bocelli's story as a simple inspirational arc. Blind boy overcomes the odds, becomes a star. But the truth is more complicated and more interesting than that. It's a story about a mother who refused to give up on a pregnancy doctors doubted. About a boy who found in music the one thing his eyes could never take from him. About a man who built an entire law degree and career before finally trusting the voice that had been with him since childhood. And about a family that has, in an industry built on exposure, quietly protected what it chooses to keep private. Bocelli himself has often suggested that his blindness, rather than being simply an obstacle he overcame, actually shaped the way he hears, and therefore sings in ways sight never could have. He has said that not being able to see the audience frees him, in a strange way, to connect with them more purely through sound alone. Whether or not that's true in some measurable sense, it captures something essential about how he seems to understand his own life. Not as tragedy followed by triumph, but as one continuous, unbroken relationship with sound, beginning in a farmhouse in Tuscany and carrying, note by note, all the way to stadiums filled with people who have never met him but somehow feel, when he sings, like they know exactly who he is. That, more than any single award or record-breaking chart position, may be the real story of Andrea Bocelli. A voice that turned darkness into a way of seeing the world, and then generously shared that vision with everyone willing to listen.